let's add authentication to our Remix app. We're going to do this with GitHub. So let's head over to GitHub and click sign in, and then click your little avatar and go down to settings. At the bottom of this sidebar, you'll find developer settings and then OAuth apps, and click new OAuth app. The name of this one is going to be Chatter. Our homepage URL for development is going to be http://localhost over port 3000. And you can find your authorization callback URL in your Supabase dashboard under the authentication menu and then providers. And we're going to scroll down this list to find GitHub. So here we can copy our redirect URL and go back over to GitHub and paste it in here as our authorization callback URL, and then click register application. This will give us the two values that we need to tell Supabase about, which is our client ID and our client secret. We can copy our client ID here and paste it in under these authentication settings for GitHub. And then for our client secret, we need to click generate a new client secret. And then we'll see this secret value once, so make sure you copy it before it's gone and go back to our authentication settings in Supabase and paste it in as our client secret value. And then we can enable GitHub here and click save. So our users will now be able to sign into our application using GitHub or an email and password, which is on by default. Back in our application, let's create a new login component. So let's create a new folder, again at the root level of our application called components, and in there we want a login.tsx file. And this component is going to simply render out two buttons, one for logout and one for login. When we click the login button, it's going to call this handle login function, which we can declare here. And this is just going to use our Supabase client that we've imported and call .auth.signin with OAuth. This function allows us to pass in which providers we'd like to use. So in this case, just GitHub. And then if there's an error during that sign-in process, we just want to console log it out. We also need to declare our handle logout function. So we'll do that here. So this one is very similar. We're just using Supabase to say .auth.signout. And again, if there's an error, we'll console log it out so we can do some debugging. So let's render our new login component in our index.tsx file. So that's under app routes index.tsx. And now rather than just rendering out our pre-tag, we want to render out a fragment. We can put our pre-tag back in there. And then we also want to render out our login component, which is going to be imported from components/login. And we just need to get rid of that semicolon. Now, if we head back over to the browser and refresh, everything looks okay. But if we click this login button, nothing's going to happen. And if we have a look in the console, we'll see this error saying uncaught reference error, process is not defined. And this is because our Supabase utility, which we're using to create a Supabase client for us, relies on these two environment variables that only exist when we're running in a server context. So when we're running in a loader or an action. But our login component, which is being triggered when we click one of these buttons, which is happening when our application is loaded in our user's browser. And in the browser, we don't have those environment variables exposed because that would be a security risk. Hence the error that process is not defined. This means our supabase.ts file should really be called supabase.server.ts. And I'm just going to let VS Code update the imports for me. Now, the server part of this file name is a convention that tells Remix we don't want any of the code that's in this file to end up in the user's browser. And so this utility file will work fine for our index.tsx file when we're creating a Supabase client, because this is happening in a loader, which is being run on the server, and so therefore has access to our environment variables. If we want to make those environment variables available to our client-side components, we need to pipe them through from the server. And the best place to do that is in our root.tsx file, which wraps around our entire application. So if we scroll down to what we're actually returning from our root.tsx, this outlet component is a special component that basically gets swapped out for whichever route we have active from our routes directory. So if I was to put a paragraph here that said hi, and then we went back to the browser, and we can close the console now, but we'll see that text, hi, appearing above our index.tsx component. And if we were to instead move this paragraph tag to below our outlet, then if we go back to the browser, we'll see that it's rendering below. So this root.tsx file is rendered on every page of our application and is a great place to do global stuff for our application, like pipe through these environment variables for our Supabase client. So let's start by exporting out a loader function. And again, we can import our type for loader args from remixrun/node. Now let's construct a new object of environment variables that we want to be able to expose from the server side. So this will be our supabase URL, which we can get from process.env.supabase URL. And we'll put our exclamation point there. And then we also want our supabase anon key. We can then return this env object using the JSON helper. And that one comes in from remixrun/node. And now in our component, we can destructure that env object from what we get back by calling use loader data, which comes in from remixrun/react. And we can give it the type of loader to infer our TypeScript types. And we can now create a new supabase client by calling useState, which comes in from React, and passing it a function, which calls createClient, which comes in from @supabase/supabase.js. And again, this one needs a supabase URL and a supabase anon key. So we can get those from this env object that got returned from our loader. So this will be env.supabase URL and env.supabase anon key. If you haven't seen this funky syntax before of calling useState and passing it a function, this just ensures that we're only creating one supabase client that we can then share across our entire application, and useState will never be called again, so it'll be the same singleton instance forever, which is important when we're using supabase client-side. Now to make this supabase client available to any component across our entire application, we want to use the context prop on our outlet component. We can then give it our supabase client. And now back over in our login component, instead of importing our supabase client, we're going to get that single instance by calling useOutletContext, which comes in from remixrun/react. And now we're getting some red squigglies under supabase, and that's because this is now implicitly any. We don't have those nice type declarations that came along with our server instance of our supabase client. But we can do the same thing in root.tsx by importing the type for database. And then when we're calling createClient in our component, we can pass across those types for our database. And now if we have a look at the type for our supabase client here, we'll see that that is properly typed. However, our login component is still red. And so if we have a look, this is still implicitly any. And that's because we need to tell our useOutletContext which types to expect. So we can declare that up in our root.tsx file. We can create a new type for a typed supabase client, which can be equal to a supabase client, which is a type that comes in from @supabase/supabase.js. And then we just need to pass along those database types. And we now have our own custom type for a typed supabase client. So we can then export a new type for supabase outlet context. And this can be equal to an object that has the key supabase, which is a typed supabase client. We can then declare the type of our useOutletContext here to be supabase outlet context, which we can import from our root. And again, I'm just going to add the type keyword here and add an extra line for consistency. And we can now see that our supabase client is now correctly typed as a typed supabase client. And if we head back to the browser and refresh, we can now click this login button, and it's going to take us through the proper GitHub OAuth flow. So I'm going to authorize this application. This is then going to redirect us back to our Remix application. And if we open up the console and go across to storage, open up local storage, which is how Supabase.js stores our access token, we'll see that we are successfully signed in. We can also validate that we have a new user in Supabase by going over to our dashboard and coming across to authentication and users and seeing that we now have that new user who is signed in through GitHub. Now that users can sign into our application, let's restrict our messages to only display if our user is currently logged in. Let's start by adding a new column to our messages table in Supabase, which is going to store the user that sent this message. So let's add a new column to our messages table. The name of this is going to be user_ID. And since this column is going to be a reference to the table that Supabase uses to manage auth sessions, we're going to click Add Foreign Key Relation. Now the table we would like to reference is in the auth schema, and it is called users. And the column we would like to reference is the ID column. Let's click Save to set up that relationship. And since a message should always belong to a particular user that sent it, we would like to untick this Allow Nullable tick box. However, when we click Save, we'll get this error because the existing messages in our database don't yet belong to a user. So in order to create our new column, we'll leave this Allow Nullable tick box enabled and click Save. And then to get the ID for our currently signed in user, we'll head over to Authentication and then Users. And then we'll see this is my account that I used GitHub to sign up for. And over here, I have my user ID, which I can click to copy. We can then go back to our table editor and messages, and then right click our field for user ID and say edit row. We can then add our user ID here. We can also click view data, and this will show us the full row that this user ID value is referencing. So we can see all of the different fields that Supabase uses for managing the session of this user. Let's click close and then scroll down and save to write this value to the column. We'll then do the same thing for our second message. And now we can edit this user ID column and untick this field for Allow Nullable, meaning that we must have a user for every single message in our database. Since we've now changed the structure of our database, our TypeScript types will actually be incorrect. TypeScript has no idea about this user ID column. We can use the same command as earlier to generate our TypeScript types. If we now look at the shape of our message, we'll see our user_ID column, which is flowing through our entire application. And if we restart our development server by typing npm run dev, and then refresh our application in the browser, we'll see that our user ID column is also coming back from Supabase. But if we log out our user, we're still seeing these results, even if we refresh. So let's update our row-level security policy in Supabase, which is currently just enabling read access for anyone. And let's instead set the target role to be authenticated. This means that the expression here will only be evaluated if the user is currently signed in. Otherwise, the default behavior of RLS will happen, which is denying all actions by default. In other words, we are only allowing signed in users to read messages. Let's click Review to update our policy and save to run that SQL. And now if we go back to our application and refresh, we'll see that we don't get any results from Supabase because our user is not currently signed in.